they've really done this experiential learning. So they have people come into the lab and they give half the people placebo alcohol and half of them real alcohol. And then they have them hang out and they all think that they're actually drinking real alcohol. And
Mm.
then after hanging out for like half an hour, they say, surprise, half of you had placebo alcohol. Do you know who did? And they can never get it right with 100% accuracy. They're always getting it wrong, both about themselves and the other people who are drinking. And they use this as an opportunity to say, yes, alcohol has its pharmacological effects, but it also has these psychological effects driven by our expectancies and that self-fulfilling prophecy
Mm.
and that placebo effect. I don't know how we'll do it with food. I wish there was a placebo brownie. But I think the key thing is giving that personal feedback.
Today, I'm excited to introduce to my special guest, Dr. Jenna Cummings. She is a health psychologist with interest in the biopsychosocial causes and effects of health-related behaviors, particularly eating behaviors. She earned her PhD in health psychology at the University of California, Los Angeles, and completed postdoctoral training in developmental science at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and the Eunice Kennedy Shriver National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. Without further ado, here's my conversation with Dr. Jenna Cummings. Jenna, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me, Christina.
Of course, your research is amazing, and I'm so privileged and delighted that you're here today to talk about your research. It has so much relevancy to me and to my audience. My first question, because it's so, I think it's so cool that you're a researcher in this space. I don't oftentimes have people who have PhDs and are actually in the trenches in the research. I'd love to know, if you don't mind, if you could share a tiny bit of your personal journey on how you became a researcher in this space. Like, how did you become passionate about this topic? Is it because you had a personal challenge, or was it a family member or friend, like, to get into the field of like emotional food expectancies? And we'll get into what that is in a moment. But, how did you land in this?
So my path is hardly straightforward.
Okay.
I grew up in Florida, and my mother is a hairstylist, and my father is a AC mechanic. And
Oh.
so my sister, brother, and I were going to university when our parents didn't. And
Mhm.
so I really didn't know where that would take me. I more just went out of this notion that society teaches you, right, that university is the path to a professional career and making money. But I
Yeah.
always was someone, when I was young, I was interested in so many different things. And at school, I actually I didn't have a hard time paying attention. I was fascinated with a lot of different subjects. So how that made university difficult is I didn't know where to focus in on. I just wanted to keep kind of studying a little bit of everything. But one sort of commonality I had in all of that is I always like to write. I like to sit and think about things and then journal and write about them down. So I thought, oh, I'll be a writer. And it was 2008 when I started university, and I went to my first journalism class, and the professor was like, this field is dying, technology is changing everything, printed news is not going to be around much longer. So if I were all of you, I'm not sure if I would continue in this career path. And I was like,
Whoa.
okay, great, strike one. So I ended up at a career center at my university taking different assessments, which I can now tell you as a psychologist, there's actually a lot of debate if those personality
Mhm.
assessments actually are accurate or predictive of where
Mhm.
you might be a good fit. But mine said that psychology might be something that I'm a good fit for. And so I started taking some psychology classes, but I found myself really drawn into the research methods class, which is one of the required classes that if you have any interest in a topic of psychology, you do need to take that research methods class to learn about the science of psychology rather than just like the everyday conversations we have with our friends and family about psychology.
Mhm.
And I was just blown away by the idea that you could take something like just a thought you had of why someone behaved a certain way, and you could actually design a research study to test if that was true. And you could do it in a systematic, scientific, rigorous way. So then that way you would really have evidence to say, oh, people are behaving this way because of this, not just because I think this, but because we actually saw from this study that they could. So that's how I got into it, and I just got hooked, and I started volunteering as the research assistant, helping other PhD students and professors on their studies. And then when it came to the psychology of eating behavior, how I got interested in that actually was in a elective class. I had taken a public health course. I think I just generally have always been interested in like how does one live their life to the fullest and wellest experience they could have. And in that class, they teach you about leading causes of burden and illness. And then they show you the risk factors for these different leading causes. And on every single slide, there was a word that said lifestyle/diet. And I asked my professor of that course, could you tell us a little bit more about that? But he was trained as a physician, so he really didn't have more to say about it. He was like, it's behavior,
Mm,
eat a balanced diet. And I thought, okay, there's more to uncover here because I'm learning in psychology that behavior isn't that simple. And
mhm.
now this is a behavior that could be really important to study because it affects all these different outcomes. And that led me to health psychology and my graduate training in health psychology with a focus on understanding, okay, so besides knowing, which foods affect our body in a certain way, how do we emotionally and socially relate to food? How is it a part of our everyday lives?
That's so fascinating. And it seems to me from your research, you're also, I mean, you've published papers with Ashley Gearhart and other people kind of in the food addiction space. So it seems like you are sort of in that realm. How did you get involved with that? Because when I think of people who are involved in health and eating psychology and food, a lot of times it comes with sort of like traditional paradigms, but it seems that you are very knowledgeable about sugar addiction and that sort of thing. So how did you get wrapped up in that?
Yeah. So in my story of my trajectory, I mentioned I volunteered for different research labs to get experience. One of the labs that I volunteered with and then eventually was able to get a paid position with was an addiction lab focused on alcohol, but really interested in how different teenagers might be at greater or less risk for developing an alcohol use disorder versus just maybe trying some alcohol, having some experiences, but being able to manage their drinking behavior. And so in that laboratory, as you know, I helped collect data on a study, but I also got to talk to the researchers there, see the graduate students there present on their research. And so I learned a lot about addiction theory while at the same time my interest in public health were going on. And then I went to graduate school focused more on the eating behavior and the public health aspects, but always was like tickling me in the back of my head, like that stuff that you learned about in your undergrad lab about addiction seems really relevant here, but not as many people are talking about it at the time. Now, a lot more people are talking about it. And then I got to a point at the end of my PhD where I was deciding what I was going to do next. And I had learned about Ashley's research and had always admired it. And we ended up meeting at a conference and having conversations and realizing she had a similar background where she had started in an addiction research lab and
Mhm.
learning all the theory relevant to addiction, but being like, this has to be relevant to eating behavior too, and to the foods we see now in our environment that are high in fat, sugar, and salt. And so we had a discussion, and she told me about a postdoc opportunity at University of Michigan. And then I
Mm.
applied and was accepted, and then I went and worked with her for 2 years. So that's how I ended up collaborating with her and getting more into the food addiction space.
Amazing, amazing. That's so cool. And so now you are, so feel free to correct me if I'm wrong in anything. So it seems like the focus of your research nowadays is expectancy theory slash food related emotional expectancies. I think that's fascinating. And I would love if you could talk about what is that for those of us. I mean, I kind of really only knew about it when you sort of clued me in. I started delving into it. But for the people who are listening or who may be watching, what is that and how does that relate to appetitive behavior and food addiction slash sugar addiction?
I'll break it apart to its simplest point points. Apologies to the audience who's like, this is too simple. You can go more complicated, but it's better to get us all on the same starting page. So
Yeah.
theory, right, is just a collection of different facts and evidence to have an explanation about behavior generally. There's different theories in psychology. A few of them have lasted over time. So early psychologists have generated them, and we've found evidence to support them or refine them, keep them going. A lot of them have not been supported over time, but one that has been quite long lasting, that there's researchers talking about this idea all the way back in like 1900. And it's this idea that we really are prediction making machines. Like our brains work in such a way so that we're always trying to anticipate different outcomes so that we can make decisions and how we should behave. And so expectancy theory is a reflection of that. It's a theory that predicts the way that we behave is based off of our expectations. Those expectations had to start somewhere, and some of those expectations might actually start from initial learning and experiences. So I think we can start with alcohol as an example because it's a bit more straightforward. So the first time you have a drink of alcohol, maybe you're with your friends, maybe you were feeling a little bit blue, but then you have that sip of alcohol, and now the alcohol is affecting your central nervous system and you're having a bit of a buzz and a high. And so you're feeling happy and you're with your friends. It's a new experience. And so you would take that memory and encode it. And the next time that you're in a situation where maybe you're cued, there's an alcohol cue present, or a friend asks you if you want to drink, you have that anticipation that I'm going to feel that same way again. I'm going to feel that joy, that excitement. But the brain isn't perfect. So we oftentimes anticipate more than what we end up experiencing. We over sort of estimate that that same exact experience will happen again. The other way that we can form expectations, though, is not even by our own experience. So kids who haven't even had a sip of alcohol also have strong anticipations of how alcohol will make them feel. And that's because we also learn socially, right? So I don't just learn from my experiences, but we're always watching other people's behavior. And this can start, they've seen even in like preschool kids, they already know alcohol will make me feel XYZ. And it's because they're watching their parents drink. They're watching
Mhm.
TV shows where it may not be a focus of the show, but kids are absorbing everything. Then there's also advertising out and about in town when you're out, or also on the television. So, food related emotional expectancies is taking this same theory, but applying it in the domain of food. And I chose the word food and food related specifically because I didn't think it's just about eating. Like I could have an anticipation about how eating anything would make me feel. But I wanted to focus in on how different types of food might make us feel, right? Because eating is something we have to do, but we don't necessarily have to eat Doritos every day, and we don't have to eat kale every day. So there's a lot of variability in what we could choose to eat. So I am interested in our anticipations about those specific types of food rather than the behavior in general. And then I focus on emotional expectancies because there's research to suggest with the alcohol work and even some early work looking at this in food that it's the emotional anticipation that's most pertinent to our decision making, which makes sense if we think about us as humans. Our emotions are really supposed to drive our behavior, communicate to ourselves and other people like what our motivations are. And they've looked at like expectations about other things like the cost of a food or how full the food might make you feel or what the food's going to be like texturally and feel like in your mouth. And all of those things do predict behavior too, but not quite as much as our emotional expectancies. So, food related emotional expectancies, just the big long chain of words for whether or not I think I'm going to feel positive or negative emotions after I eat different kinds of food.
I didn't realize it's so you were the one who coined the food related emotional expectancies phrase.
Yeah, but based on a lot of long-standing work in expectancy theory. Yeah.
Yeah. Is there a relationship between the degree of processing of certain foods. Like, I don't know if you are dealing with like the Nova classification system or anything, but is there a relationship between the like processed food and food related emotional expectancies?
Yeah, so in our initial work, when we were figuring out, okay, now we have this idea of food-related emotional expectancies, does it actually predict anything meaningful? Is it a useful concept to understand eating different kinds? And so then the first thing we have to do is, okay, well, how do we measure that? How do we get at people's anticipated thoughts about the different ways they're going to feel? And so we have to create a measurement tool. And in creating that measurement tool, we piloted. So we did a smaller sales study where we just open ended asked a group of people online, what kind of emotions do you think you'll feel when you eat? And we asked them about two food groups. And at the time we selected this was, 5 to 10 years ago. So even in that time, we've drastically changed the way we talk about food in terms of like the ultra processing you mentioned, or hyper palatable foods, another term now, or
Mhm.
foods high in fat, sugar, salt. I've learned since coming to the UK, this is a common word that they use to describe the foods they want to regulate here.
Mhm.
And so we didn't have those terms yet. And so what we decided to do with this questionnaire is have two types of food that we would be interested in studying broadly: the foods that we generally want people to eat more of, like fruit and vegetables, and the foods we generally want people to eat less of, foods like snacks, salty snacks, sugary drinks, fast foods. And we just asked people their anticipated emotions for those types of food. Now that we're coming out with this new research and we're getting a better idea about exactly what kind of attributes make a food, I have tried to go back and add more of that specification into my research. So one way I've done this is I recently did an interview study with folks from the Liverpool area, which is where I'm at now. And we just asked them to think of all the different foods that they associated with these different kinds of positive and negative emotions. And we just wrote them all down. And then I went to the UK. It's called the COFID. It's a composition of food data set where nutritionists have gone through and they go to the grocery store and they get like 5 or 10 samples of
Mhm.
a bag of bread, for example. And then they average out across those, like, what's the level of calories in this food item, the level of salt, sugar, fat, etc. And so what I did, I went through these foods that people were just listing that were coming to their mind when they were thinking of these different emotional expectancies, and I coded them against this data set. I didn't code for ultra processing because that would be challenging to do, because you need to know not just the ingredients of the food, but also whether people are referring to a food that is a manufactured version of a food. So when they're saying cake, are they meaning a cake with the food coloring, with the additives, with the preservatives that's at the store
Mhm.
ready to eat? Or are they meaning like grandma's cake that she made last
Mhm.
weekend? And so we just didn't have that level of detail in the way that people were describing their foods. So we weren't able to code for ultra processing according to Nova. But I did code to see if foods would be defined as high in fat, sugar, and salt based off of the nutrient profiling model used in the UK. And
Mhm.
half of the foods that were named for the positive emotions were, in fact, high in fat, sugar, and salt. But
Mhm.
interestingly, half of the foods that were named for the negative emotions were also high in fat, sugar, and salt.
Mhm.
Fruit and vegetables were hardly mentioned in the positive or negative. So
Mhm.
people just weren't thinking of those foods when they were thinking of their emotions, which is a data point itself. And then some other food groups came up that I hadn't thought about before. So with the positive emotions, a lot of cultural ethnic foods came up. So like Greek food, Mediterranean food, Italian food, foods that you would eat at social gathering. And then with the negative emotions, not all of the negative emotions, but with boredom, a lot of that is where we saw the fruit and vegetables come up the most. And also just kind of bland foods like bread, just plain bread, or things like water, tea,
Mhm.
coffee. So it's interesting because it highlights that maybe that's part of the reason that people eat less of those foods or have a hard time with them, is like, even if they know that they might feel better afterwards, or it could be helpful for a goal to drink more water or eat a fruit or veg. If you're anticipating that you're going to feel kind of bored and let down, why would you take that option? And so that was something interesting that came out of thinking more about these different food types. But I have some data coming in, so stay tuned. Where we just in a population study of the UK, we showed people, I think like 35 different images of foods, and we had them rate expectancies for these different foods. So, do I expect to feel really happy when I eat this versus this, this,
Mhm,
this, this?
mhm,
And we've had like 1,200 people answer this. And so what I can do is rank, like in the UK population at least, which foods are the foods that most people on average are expecting the most happiness from. And
mhm.
the other neat thing we did in that study is for some of the foods, we showed them the food twice, the same exact food, but we either showed it in its packaging or showed it without its packaging.
Oh, wow.
Because there's this idea that yes, the food itself might you might have expectations of how that might make you feel. But if you add in the social environment of how these foods have been advertised and shown to you as, you know, deliberately shown to you as this is going to make you feel happier. When you're sad, this is the food that you should eat. Comfort in every bar, right? Like with Snickers. And so I'm curious to see if the exact same food, but in the packaging that is associated with that marketing, is that going to lead to a different anticipation of how that food will make you feel?
Interesting. One thing that's coming to mind is like maybe this is future research, but it's like, what are we doing with this data that you're getting, right? And I think like, okay, well, it's not necessarily that we always want to have, a certain expectancy with a certain type of food. Like, oh, well, ultra processed food, we always want a negative expectancy or something. It sounds like that's not necessarily it. Maybe for certain populations, it is sort of being able to modify the expectancy and also thinking about it in sort of a longer term way where if someone has like thinking about it like short term and then next day or the next hour or 5 hours later if someone's expecting something to make them like feel like that's sweet numbing out or something and they have this positive expectancy, and correct me if I'm wrong with the terminology here, but then 2 hours later, they're feeling super crappy because it's not landing well in their body. Their mind is feeling shame because they know that that food's not good for them, but they did it anyway. And so you would want to align the longer term effect with like the immediate emotional expectation. Is it something like that? Is that where some of the research might be going?
Yeah, I love your question because it just shows how contextually dependent this is going to be if we do apply it in some kind of intervention way. So I'll tell you my thoughts and opinions based off of my findings so far, but I really have not started any intervention development research yet because I really want to make sure I'm understanding the basic processes correct before I do anything. So that way, hopefully we could shift expectancies in a way that would be beneficial and not harmful.
Makes sense. Yeah.
Yes, because one of the challenges is it's clear to me from the data that yes, people have these positive emotional expectancies, but they also already have negative emotional expectancies. So it's not as simple as like we want to
With that
hone in
same
and
food, like with
yes,
the
with
same
that
food,
same
positive
food,
and
they
negative.
think that they will feel really happy and also feel really anxious and ashamed and down. And so it's actually people seem to already have this quite ambivalent relationship with food. I've done research in younger folks and we don't see the ambivalence yet. So I imagine the ambivalence is coming online in a developmental period after you've struggled with perhaps trying to change your eating behavior and failing at it, or experience some kind of stigma or shame around your body, and so now you're having these negative associations with the food. I think it's really delicate then. How do we shift expectancies? It's not as simple as like with alcohol, maybe you would think with kids, like, oh, it's straightforward. We can show them negative outcomes of alcohol use. But even in the alcohol expectancy challenges, that's not what they do. They don't focus on the negative, they focus on reducing the positive so that it's fit more neutral and realistic and just managing expectations so they match reality. because
Mm.
the issue is the emotional effects that food have are short-lived, like you mentioned, and they're quite small. And comparatively to other activities that we could do to mood boost, they're either equivalent or less than. And so in that moment though, of that anticipation, how do you keep all of that in mind? And so the way they've done it with alcohol is they've really done this experiential learning. So they have people come into the lab and they give half the people placebo alcohol and half of them real alcohol. And then they have them hang out and they all think that they're actually drinking real alcohol. And
Mm.
then after hanging out for like half an hour, they say, surprise, half of you had placebo alcohol. Do you know who did? And they can never get it right with 100% accuracy. They're always getting it wrong, both about themselves and the other people who are drinking. And they use this as an opportunity to say, yes, alcohol has its pharmacological effects, but it also has these psychological effects driven by our expectancies and that self-fulfilling
Mhm.
prophecy and that placebo effect. And so it's just something to be mindful. And they find that doing that can decrease the positive alcohol expectancies and then decrease the binge drinking. I don't know how we'll do with food. I wish there was a placebo brownie. But I think the key thing is giving that personal feedback. So, one idea I've had is about tracking people's mood in real time and giving them the feedback of, like, okay, so you actually felt happy for 2 minutes and then you actually felt worse. Uh, but again, I'm not sure if that will increase the negative and backfire in some way. Another
Mm.
thing I've thought about is just helping people to be more articulate about the negative emotions rather than putting all negative experiences into a shame bucket of like,
Mm.
I ate this, I overate, I'm a bad person. Separating out those kind of emotions, which we would hopefully work on in therapy or as a society, as we're communicating, like there is no shame. You are not a good or bad person for what you choose to eat. But
Yeah.
maybe if we could separate those negative emotions out from negative emotions like tired, sluggish, because
Mhm.
those actually are meaningful communications to yourself. Like, actually, maybe I don't want to be eating like this because I would like to feel energized later, or I wouldn't like to feel, I don't know, down and feel not as bright as my usual self. And so honing in on that without the anxiety and the shame, that's another way we could think about it. But really, I think focusing on neutralizing the positive, doing some kind of comparators like, yeah, you felt really happy, but also you felt just as happy when you were watching your TV show without eating,
Yeah.
or you were outside on a 5 minute walk and you felt just as good, or actually when you were listening to your music, you felt just as good, and just sort of re educating people on their own emotional experiences. And the way I see this really happening, though, is with smartwatch technology, which is where I'm going next with my research. Yeah.
Really? Can you tell us a little bit more? Give us a
Yeah.
sneak preview. So how would it be through the smart watch technology?
Yeah. So I have met with some researchers, collaboration between engineers and psychologists, and they are getting it down to nearly 90% accuracy of knowing when people eat because of the way they move their wrists when they're eating.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and this really could be revolutionarily like a revolution to the field of eating behavior, because while there's a lot of research to show that tracking behavior can be really helpful in educating someone about their behavior and then how they might change it, it also is quite burdensome to somebody. And in the case of when I'm thinking about emotional relationships to food, I'm always trying to imagine, is there a way that we could think about our emotional relationship to food without thinking about any of the other stuff that we normally think about when we think about food, like without thinking about the calories or without thinking
Hmm.
about the macros. Like
Right.
truly, could I communicate with someone about their emotional relationship with food, and that's it. And so with this method, what we are able to design and what I'll be piloting this fall is an app where people are just going around in their everyday life. And then when they start eating, their smartwatch buzzes and says, are you eating right now? And they say, oh, yeah, I am. And then it will just ask them some questions about, what's your mood like right now? Are you feeling XYZ? That's it. And then, 30 minutes or an hour after they're eating, just also ask them how are they feeling, and throughout the day randomly, but having those eating connected emotions as well. And so then I could really give people feedback on, like, at the end of the week, I could say, okay, so I was looking at your emotions throughout the week. And, when you were eating, this is what it looked like. But when you weren't eating, this is what it looked like. And kind of have those more really data driven conversations with people, which maybe people would be fascinated by that, the same way they are with like looking at their sleep data or their heart rate
Right.
data or
Right.
something else. So just something I'm trying out to see if it could be something that is helpful for people. As part of that research too, I'll also be getting a lot of feedback from people on their ideas of like, would they find that annoying? Would they find it helpful? If they were to get feedback, how would they like that feedback delivered? Would they want it every day? Would they want it once a week? Would they, want it to point out positive and negative emotions, or would they just want it to focus on positive emotions? So we could really tailor it to what people think would be most useful for them.
Wow, that is amazing. So it'd be a special watch that would be created that the participants would have to wear, and then they would receive the questions on their like kind of like on their phone, or they would do it through their I'm sorry, through their watch, or it would be through their phone that they would type in.
Yeah, so the exciting thing is this engineer and his group. So Adam Hoover at Clemson in South Carolina, and Stephanie Goldstein, she's at Brown and the Miriam Hospital there. They have been working on this for a few years, and they have other projects that they could describe to you of all the amazing things they're doing with this method. But this app can be used on like an Android smartwatch or an Apple smartwatch. So it
Okay.
could be something that eventually could be brought into the digital world. So it's not a new device is not needed for it.
Well, that is fascinating. You are doing amazing things, and I can't wait to hear about how all this goes. It's just so completely innovative. Thanks for doing this. I love your creative and brilliant brain. And thank you so much for being here today and sharing with us about your important research. If people have questions or just curious about your research, what's the best way for them? Do you have like a website to point them to?
Yeah, so I don't know the exact URL off the top of my head, but if you Google Jenna Cummings, University of Liverpool, my webpage will come up with different publications and focuses on my research. And then if you ever had an inquiry about doing something like this, some kind of science communication, you can email me at jenna.cummings@liverpool liverpool.ac.uk.
Great. I will be sure to include that in the episode description. Thank you so much for being here, Jenna. It's been a pleasure.
Awesome. Thank you, Christina.